All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome everybody to today's webinar, First Impressions, How to Develop a Professional CV for Each Stage of Your Career by Hannah Bergman and Vas Mikopoulos. My name is Astrid Masfar. I am the Senior Education and Outreach Coordinator here at ADAA. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's webinar. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio panel and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the chat box of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time and we will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end. I would now like to introduce Drs. Hannah Bergman and Vas Mikopoulos. Dr. Hannah Bergman is a licensed clinical psychologist and project director of the UW Stress Check study at the University of Washington. Dr. Bergman completed her doctoral degree in clinical psychology at Case Western Reserve University and clinical psychology internship training at the VA Puget Sound Seattle Division in 2017. Her clinical interests include providing evidence-based care to individuals with PTSD and comorbid related disorders. Her research interests focus on identifying factors that impact PTSD treatment decision-making and treatment outcome. Dr. Bergman has been an ADA member since 2012. Dr. Vas Mikopoulos is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Emory University and an affiliate scientist at the Yerkes National Primate Research Center. She is a behavioral neuroendocrinologist who received her undergraduate degree in neuroscience from the University of Virginia and her PhD in neuroscience from Emory University. Dr. Mikopoulos' translational research is focused on understanding how adverse social experience, including chronic stress and trauma exposure, results in a number of adverse mental outcomes and comorbid physical health diseases and conditions. She is particularly interested in understanding why females are more at risk for stress-induced conditions than males. Dr. Mikopoulos has been an ADA member since 2014 and is a member of the ADA Board of Directors. I'm now going to take a moment to pass the screen to our experts. There will be a brief pause while I do so.
Okay. Can everyone see that first slide?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So we will get started. So our presentation outline is we'll kind of briefly talk about how we got to where we are in our current positions. We'll share just general tips about CV writing. And then Vas will focus on tips for research-oriented CVs, and I'll focus on tips for clinical-oriented CVs.
All right, thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Vas Mikopoulos. Astrid, thanks for the introduction and for helping organize this webinar and to ADAA. Just to kind of give you a little bit of background on myself, a little bit more detail than Astrid just mentioned. I am trained as a behavioral neuroscientist. I actually came to Emory as a graduate student back in 2005 and did a dissertation studying psychosocial stress exposure in a non-human primate translational model. During my time at Emory in my predoctoral work, I also completed a master's in clinical research as part of an ACTSI training program that Emory had available. And I actually stayed local and completed my postdoctoral fellowship work, working with the Grady Trauma Project with Dr. Carrie Ressler, Tanya Jovanovich, Barbara Rothbaum, kind of getting some experience on working with clinical populations and with individuals and humans who study from trauma and stress-related disorders. And really kind of trained myself to do translational neuroscience, trying to understand how stress and trauma can impact mental health and physical health adversely with a focus on women's health. After interviewing a couple places for a faculty position, I actually ended up staying at Emory, where I am now an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Scientists, and also have a joint appointment at the National Primate Research Center that we have here. All right.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Just so you all know how this platform is set up, I can only see the PowerPoint presentation. I can't see anything else. So let me know if anything looks wonky. But my name is Hannah Bergman. I am currently a clinical psychologist at the University of Washington, and I'm project director of a randomized controlled trial. It's a motivational interviewing-based intervention. It's done over the phone, and our population is active duty service members from Joint Base Lewis McChord, so soldiers and airmen who report symptoms of PTSD but are not currently engaged in PTSD treatment. And our intervention is testing if we can increase likelihood of engagement in some kind of PTSD treatment. We, of course, focus on evidence-based psychotherapies, but really kind of meet them where they're at. Prior to this, this is a 2-year position, so my first year was kind of my postdoc, so I've stayed on in my current role as a clinical psychologist. My graduate program was at Case Western Reserve University, and so my background is really in PTSD treatment, and coming from Nora Feeney's lab, so I've been trained in prolonged exposure, and throughout my graduate years, I was part of an ongoing clinical trial, so I was one of the study therapists and assessors as well. And then for internship, I went to the Seattle VA and continued kind of advancing my training specifically in PTSD. So I was trained in cognitive processing therapy, and I rotated through the PTSD clinic, the primary care clinic, as well as their substance use clinic. My trajectory through all of grad school has really been more clinically oriented. So now that I'm kind of starting to look at jobs, I'm really looking at permanent positions either back in the VA system or in a DoD setting, so working, continuing my work with active duty service members. Okay.
All right, so just off the bat, we wanted to kind of lay out the groundwork for what the difference is between a CV or a curriculum vitae, a resume, and also the NIH biosketch, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. And so the main differences between these 3 documents are the length, their purpose, and their layout. So a resume really is a very brief summary of all your skills and your experiences. Typically, resume are no more than 2 pages. They're very specialized to the application that you are submitting and the job you're submitting, so on and so forth. It is pretty much a very concise picture of your qualifications for a specific position. A CV, on the other hand, really is something that's used in academia probably the most, but is really an exhaustive, comprehensive, total list of all the experience, the skills that you have acquired over the course of your career, and it really includes many different aspects, which will go in a lot more detail in a couple of slides, and has no page limitations. If you talk to your mentors or advisors, or you'll find that the further on in your career you go, CVs can be upwards of 50 to 100, 150 pages. The NIH biosketch, on the other hand, kind of is a hybrid of a resume and a CV. It's very formulaic. What needs to be included in the biosketch is mandated by the National Institutes of Health. They can only be 5 pages or less. And so they are kind of pointed and specific to the application you may be applying for, but also summarize your expertise and your experience that may be relevant to the application that you're putting in. And again, we'll go into these in much more detail.
So before we kind of get into more specifics of more concrete examples of what a research-oriented CV versus a clinical-oriented CV might look like, we first wanted to discuss kind of some general CV tips that would apply kind of no matter what kind of CV you'll be writing. So first, some of these do come from questions we got prior to this presentation. So this idea of, when you're actually sending your CV off, should you send it as a Word doc or a PDF? My inclination is to always send it as a PDF. It means that someone can't accidentally edit or change it. Certainly, if you want folks to edit it, proofread, send the Word doc, but I would say for that final draft, save it as a PDF and send it that way. That way, no one can accidentally change it. Typically on a CV, you'll have some kind of header. It can oftentimes be just your last name and page number. And also you'll have your contact information at the top of your CV. That includes obviously your name, whatever address you want to put. Some people put their personal address, others put their work address or graduate school address, whatever you're comfortable with. Whatever email address is the best, whether it's a .edu or a Gmail or Yahoo, and a cell phone number. In terms of font and margins, you do want to consider both type and size. Typically, it's, Times New Roman and size anywhere from 11 or 12 because you want to make sure it is the person's able to read your CV. And again, margins are typically about 1 inch, although it can be a little bit less. But again, you just want to make it really readable and presentable to whoever's reviewing it. And as you're doing your CV, it's really thinking about the major headings you're using, like education, publications, presentations, as well as subheadings, and then use of underlining, italics, capitalization, and bolding. The key thing here is just to make sure that whenever someone is reading it, they can clearly see those defined sections and then kind of clearly follow through your experiences. If someone is carefully reading it versus kind of quickly scanning it, they can see kind of those major headings. And then the formatting of publications and presentations, typically it'll be in APA formatting. You also want to consider dates of experiences. It'll typically start from your most recent to kind of the older experiences, but ordering kind of that chronological is newest to oldest. And we'll get into more kind of concrete examples a little later on of what that looks like. And then the really important part is have multiple people read it. And I even say having someone maybe outside of, I'm coming from psychology, but maybe someone outside of your psychology program, maybe a friend or family member, because they might pick up on things that several people just won't pick up on if you're in the same field. So really proofread, because this is, when you're submitting it, this is kind of your experiences in a nutshell. So you want to make sure there's no kind of major errors or glaring errors when you send it off.
All right, I just like to reiterate that having more people look at your CVs when they're in prep and getting their input and looking for mistakes and whatever formatting errors is super critical and very helpful. So I'm just going to go over some general tips about the content that you should make sure to include, and we will just over the course of the rest of this discuss, depending on whether it's a research position or a clinical position or what you're trying to get across, the order of things may be different. But we'll talk about what things should be included in your CV. All right, so always at the beginning, you want to include your education, your training. If you're currently in a position, you want to include what position you're currently in. Also, you want to include honors and awards at the institutional level, at any society, travel awards, whatever awards you may have received, you want to include those. If you want to include any clinical experience that you may have, research experience, and we'll go in a lot of this in more detail, so any grants, pending, funded, not funded. If you have teaching experience, you want to include those experiences. Similarly, if you have done supervision or done consultations, you also want to include that information in your CV. Also, if you have any publications, whether these are primary research articles, reviews, meta-analyses, book chapters, commentaries, edited books, you want to include all of those things. And then for CVs, there's an opportunity also to break these into manuscripts that have already been published, but also ones that are under review and in preparation that you're still working on. And then, of course, you don't want to forget, you want to include any presentations in an international, national level, any participation in symposiums, abstracts, posters that you've presented, whether you've been invited to give talks, not only at conferences, but also at other institutions, so on and so forth. You also want to make sure you include information on any professional services that you are part of, any professional membership. So if you're an ADAA member, you want to make sure that that is on your CV. Also, if you've done any advanced trainings or specialized trainings, you want to highlight that in your CV. And then finally, if you have, done any editorial work or served as an ad hoc reviewer or on a editorial board for a journal, you want to make sure you highlight and include that on your CV. All right, so the purpose of this slide is just to kind of, again, highlight that order does matter when you're putting your CV together, and depending on the final end goal of why you're putting your CV together, or the job application that you may be applying to, that is going to dictate what you highlight and when you highlight it in your CV. So for instance, the order of what you include in your CV, if you're going after a more research-oriented job, is going to look a little bit different if you're applying to a clinical position. And that's where we're going to spend most of our time talking about the differences between these two CV formats or purposes.
And then I just want to touch base on, so how often should you update your CV? And so a few things, at least when I was thinking about when I was updating my CV, especially in grad school, it was a great form of procrastination. If I was supposed to be working on a manuscript or some other thing, and I was just like, I don't want to do that, I would actually update my CV. But you also want to update it when something new happens. So this can include, don't discount your graduate school experiences. So practicum placements, research you do within your lab, and also any teaching or TA experiences. These are all things you can include in your CV. And when you're updating it, at least when I did it, it helped me kind of reflect on my experiences, and it can make you either feel good about it or potentially bad, depending on what your experiences have been. But it does allow you to really think, especially during grad school, you accumulate a lot of experiences, and so it's just really making sure you're documenting them in a way. And again, I'll show you some examples of even specific wording I used when I talked about some of my graduate school practicum and research experiences, as well as teaching experiences.
All right, so for the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to be talking about tips for research-oriented CVs. And just to kind of highlight again that depending on the job or the purpose of the CV, that is going to dictate what the CV may look like. So you may have a CV that you put together to apply for postdoctoral fellowship applications. You may have a CV where you are applying for faculty positions. Also, I just wanted to highlight that if you end up in a faculty position, or depending on your local institution, those institutions may actually have mandated formats for CVs. So here at Emory, for instance, there is a CV format that's mandated by the Emory School of Medicine format, or school, that has basically exactly what I need and what order to present it in. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about the NIH biosketch, which is another templated version of a CV that you may at some point in your career have to put together. All right, so order tips for research-oriented CVs. Here you really want to start off by highlighting your current titles and affiliations. So if you're in graduate school, highlighting that you're in graduate school, where you're in graduate school, who your primary mentor or advisor is. If you're in a postdoc position, same sort of thing. After listing where you currently are and what your current affiliations are, you want to highlight your education and your training. So where you got your undergraduate degrees, where you got your graduate degrees, and then also if you've done postgraduate training, you want to highlight where you did your postdoctoral fellowship. And then finally from there, you want to transition into listing all your honors and awards. And there are very many different types of honors and awards, whether they're institutional, regional, within society memberships and professional organizations. You want to be inclusive and list these all out. All right, the next item you want to include are any leadership positions, so any committee memberships, any editorial board committees, also professional memberships. So again, if you're a member of ADAA or any other professional organizations, you want to list those. And then finally, not finally, but really the bulk of the research-oriented CV is going to highlight your bibliography. All work that you have produced in your career. So typically individuals start off by listing their peer-reviewed published manuscripts, where you can also include review articles. You can also, as part of your CV, have separate subheadings to list manuscripts that are under review at journals or that are in preparation. Also, as part of your bibliography, you're going to want subsections for including book chapters that you may have written and published. If you've had the opportunity to edit a book or put together serve as an editor for a special issue of a journal, you want to include that. Also, if you've been invited to write any commentaries on any literature, you want to include that as a subsection of your CV. And then, of course, any other sorts. There's many different types of publications. So, for instance, published abstracts. So when you present or submit abstracts to present posters and talks at meetings, some of those abstracts actually get published in journals. And so those can get listed as published abstracts. And one way, of course, to keep track of, well, you'll know before, but occasionally logging into Web of Science or Google Scholar to see which abstracts have been published and which haven't is always something to do. All right, and then after you go through and list all your bibliography, all the things you've published or are hoping to publish, you want to list all your presentations, international, national, local, any times you've been invited to give a talk anywhere. And then you also want to highlight any research or grant support that you currently have, that you've applied for, pending, or any research or grant support that has actually been completed in time. And then finally, if you've done any teaching, depending if you're applying to an academic institution, you'll want to highlight your teaching experience and whether you've had any supervisory teaching roles or if you've mentored any students, so on and so forth. All right, so this may be a little bit blurry. I know everyone has the opportunity through GoToTraining to download the PowerPoint that we're actually speaking from, where you can kind of blow everything up. But here I just wanted to show my own CVs from when I was applying to postdoc and then when I was applying to my faculty position with name, the contact information listed at the top. As you'll see for postdoc, I've listed my education first, where I got my degrees, what year I got my degrees, and then launch into honors awards and leadership positions. And so one thing I want to note is that the chronological order of how you present your CV is really up to you. No one really mandates whether it should be most current first or the thing in the past that comes first. As far as CVs, so just make sure you're consistent, whatever form that you pick. It's very confusing to somebody if you start with more recent stuff in one section of your CV, and then you end up going back and switching the order that you present everything. And so here, everything I have it most recent to most further in the past. I have my leadership positions, my professional society memberships, and because these were applications to research track positions, off the bat, I just start with all my publications. And this is the only difference between this postdoc CV and the faculty CV is that when I was applying for my faculty position, then I basically start off by saying my current position, I'm a postdoc in so-and-so's lab. And then, of course, making sure that everything has been updated. Update. And again, when something happens, you want to get it into your CV immediately because if you don't, you'll forget about it. All right. And then the next subsection, I didn't want to put all of these here, is research support on a CV. And here I just kind of wanted to show you a general format that is used. So there's a section for active support and completed support. And then if you actually have anything that's currently under review by the funding agencies, you would have a section in the middle listed as pending support. So you would include the actual the identification for the grant, who the PI is, what the dates that you were funded or the project was funded, what the formal title of the grant was, a very brief synopsis of what the goal of the grant was, and then your role on the grants. So if either a scholar or a trainee, if you had an F31 or F32 and you were a PI, you would list yourself a PI, so on and so forth. All right, I wanted to briefly also note and highlight how a CV would look different if you were applying to a teaching-oriented position. And this is a CV that was volunteered by one of my colleagues here at Emory, who did an ADAA postdoctoral teaching fellowship. And what you'll see is, the same parts are here, but what she highlights first after education and where she's currently at in her career, she highlights her teaching experience. So teaching experience goes first, then research experience, and then grants, fellowships, awards, and she highlights pretty high up. I think her CV was, 8 pages long, pretty high up, also highlights her educational publications before she actually lists her scientific publications. All right, so switching gears a little bit to talk about the NIH biosketch. This is, again, that templated high-rate CV/resume that's format is mandated by the NIH when you submit grants. You'll have your name, you'll have an ERA Commons username that will get established by your institution when your first grant ever goes in. You'll want to make sure that your position and titles are accurate, that you have always keep your education and training up to date. And there are 5 major sections of the NIH biosketch. The first one is the personal statement, where you say, basically in a paragraph or so, what your research questions are, what you have expertise in, and then depending on the kind of application that you're putting in, you would highlight how you would be contributing to the grant that you're applying for. The second section is positions and honors, all the positions you've held, honors and awards. Here, I will say that the NIH does say the oldest stuff goes first, and you list the most current stuff in the bottom. So in the case of the biosketch, they do tell you that you should go in chronological order. You also want to include leadership positions, professional memberships. Also, the bulk of the NIH biosketch are the contributions to science. You can list or include up to 5, where you discuss what your contributions to science have been. And then as part of each of those 5 contributions, you can list up to 4 papers or publications that speak to that contribution that you've made. And so that's what I wanted to highlight with this big yellow oval, is that you can only list 4 and that they should be in chronological order. And again, you want to keep this updated. So as things are getting published, you should be updating these parts of the biosketches. And so the other yellow bar on the second page is really to highlight that one thing the NIH also mandates is that they want you to include that PMCID in your biosketch. So anything that you publish, you're mandated to put onto the NIH's website for free access to everybody. And so when that goes live, you get this number, that identification that's associated with it, that you have to keep in your biosketch. All right, another thing that is part of the biosketch is this complete list of published work in my bibliography. Through PubMed, there's a way for you to basically make your own bibliography that's associated with a link, so you can include it in your biosketch. You can also use it anywhere else you want to use it. And what essentially that does is it creates a PubWeb page that lists all of your publications. And that's what the screenshot on the right of the screen is basically showing. And then finally, the last part of the biosketch is your research support. So here you're going to include ongoing research support and also completed research support. And for completed research support, they actually want it to be within the last 3 years. So if it's older than 3 years old, they don't want it on there. All right, how I kind of went through my current biosketch as an example, but how may a biosketch when you're applying to an F31, an F32, or any of the K awards look different? They do look a little bit different. So in the case of biosketches for training grants, personal statements are usually a lot longer. They talk, you can include, talking about why you're interested in doing the research you're doing, why you're qualified, talking about the training program and your mentors and why they're a good fit. So again, a lot of that extra stuff that you can put into those biosketches really is just another place where you can show the reviewers, what you've done, why you're doing what you're doing, and how the training and the project that you've proposed are going to get you to be an independent investigator, what the end goal game is. And then as you will see on the right, the other big difference between the biosketches for training versus non-training grants is that instead of just listing research support, they will also ask you for your grades in a templated format. All right, and so I put a link down there. If you ever have questions, there's example biosketches on the NIH website.
Okay, so now switching gears to the more clinically oriented CVs, you'll see in terms of content, a lot of it's the same as the research, it's just the order changes up. So you're always, again, starting with education and training, honors and awards. But then if it's more clinically oriented, probably is a no-brainer, you're going to start with your clinical experience. And again, it's highlighting things you did during your graduate school career, internship, postdoc, things like that. So you want to make sure you're really identifying what your role was, like practicum therapist, study assessor, the location, so the name of the clinic, as well as who your primary supervisor was, or if you had more than one, kind of list out all your supervisors. You're still going to list your research experience and then your teaching experience, depending on what you want to emphasize first. Again, for clinically, you're going to start with the clinical experience, but then you could go teaching and then research. So there is some flexibility with some of these other things, but again, that clinical experience will be coming first. And then you're still going to list your peer review publications, manuscripts, whether they're under review or in prep, and then presentations, as Vas kind of already detailed. And then again, you're highlighting editorial services. So if you've reviewed or co-reviewed an article, you want to put kind of those what journals, activities, and professional service, as well as any specialized trainings and workshops. And then again, professional memberships. And then a little bit more optional, you can put research or grant support. So this is more like you're not a PI or a co-PI, but you might be funded by a grant and you just want to know kind of your role in that. And then at the very end would come references. Sometimes it's required, other times it's not, but that's where you list out whoever your references may be, whether it's your main mentor or if there's certain supervisors you want to list. And so what I wanted to do is just kind of show you my CV. It might be a little blurry, but hopefully when you download it, you can kind of zoom in. So this is what an internship application CV would look like, keeping in mind that a lot of how I templated and formatted came from seeing other people's examples of their CVs, and then I kind of picked and choose like what I kind of liked. But just to kind of highlight, especially for an internship application, again, you're starting with your education, but you're going to know you're a doctoral candidate. And then, again, this was just based on examples I saw. You're really going to put, who your main mentor or advisor is, the name of your dissertation, the chair of your dissertation, if you have to do a proposal, when that was approved, or the expected date of approval, and then also dissertation defense if you have an expected date. And you also do the same language for a master's degree as well. Whereas this is now my postdoc CV. So same information, but some of it has been truncated since I now have my degree. So you'll note for education, it should be really education and training, but I now highlight that I was currently on internship at the time when I was writing this CV. And then I note my doctoral program, and you can see on the left-hand side, I put kind of expected of when I should be graduating in 2017 because I hadn't graduated yet. And so this is now an example of a postdoc application CV. So I'm now applying for permanent psychologist positions. And so I've even kind of truncated some of this information even more. So now what I really put up in front is my current position, the fact that I'm licensed, but I still, again, have my graduate and postgraduate training. So noting my postdoctoral fellowship, my internship, and then my education. So PhD, master's, and then undergrad. And so I know for internship in particular, it's almost like your CV is a hybrid, again, between a resume and a CV. So it's kind of looking like this, very truncated, but then you have these more descriptive paragraphs in which you have to kind of provide detail of what you actually did. So here I just wanted to highlight, this is coming from my current CV of my current position, as well as one of the rotations I did on clinical internships, so you get a sense of it. So what you're really noting is obviously the dates in which you were there. So again, the name of the program, your role, and supervisors, and then you talk about what you actually did, provided, delivered, conducted, evidence-based psychotherapy, comprehensive assessment. So whatever you did, providing supervision, leading meetings. So you really want to make it in the active voice. And then again, this is another example, but this is based on my internship being in the PTSD clinic. So doing prolonged exposure with veterans who experience combat-related PTSD, doing cognitive processing therapy, doing group therapy, individual therapy, etc. And then this is just to highlight too what my current teaching experience and supervision sections look like. So for my teaching experiences, I just put I designed a course and taught it during my graduate years. So I put all the times in which I taught that. So I did both like a fall and spring semester, which is just highlighting. I put the months in particularly so people could kind of understand that. And then also noting supervision experience as well. So what I'm doing in my current role, as well as any experiences I got during my internship or during my graduate training. And so here again is just more examples of what these kind of descriptive paragraphs can look like. And I'll kind of walk you through some of the elements. So first you'll note is the date. And so because I'm applying to federal jobs, and that's typically through USA.gov, they have very specific requirements of how your CV should look. And that's in like the application kind of steps. So oftentimes we'll be including not only the date, but the month. And I've even seen one where you have to include the day if possible. So they want you to get really specific with that. So make sure you're looking at that templated language. I think when I applied for internship and postdoc, I only put the years because that was sufficient. But now that I'm applying to jobs, I'm starting to add in the month and or specific day. So again, you're highlighting, and for me, I highlighted where the location was, but you can certainly kind of highlight first what your role was. So then I noted what my role was and then who my supervisors were. And again, that descriptive paragraph really defining what I did as clinic coordinator. And another thing you might have to include, again, this is because USA Jobs, applying to federal jobs, is they will ask you to put the number of hours per week at that particular place. So you're either noting like full-time or part-time, and then the number of hours per week. And for some, especially sometimes you're doing like a partial practicum or placement, just do your best guess to kind of estimate, or I put ranges of like 10 to 12 hours per week. And then finally, this is just noting what my research experience looked like. So even though I'm applying to clinical jobs, I certainly still include this research experience. But again, I don't necessarily have those descriptive paragraphs if it's already been described in some of this research. So a lot of my kind of research experiences have also been clinical. But if it hasn't shown up in my clinical section, I might include a little paragraph just to kind of provide more information about that research experience. So again, this is just highlighting my current position as project director on the DoD funded study, and then the next from 2011 to 2016, my role on the grant that Nora Feeney and Lori Zollner had. And then prior to going to grad school, my post-bac position at NIH. It's also important to include professional service. This kind of, for me, falls towards more the end of my CV, like after my research, publications, editorial services, but certainly if this is something you want to highlight, you can think about moving it up to have it be more kind of front and center. But again, just to making sure you are updating this. So anytime you kind of do something in a professional role or activity or service, make sure you're including that. And then finally, this is what my kind of advanced trainings and professional membership sections look like. So again, this is just highlighting some of the trainings I've done. In this case, for whatever reason, I have it from the latest to the most recent, and everything else in my CV is the opposite way, so maybe I should change that. And then I list out my professional memberships. I think in some other versions I had the years, but then I got feedback of as long as it's kind of recent, then you don't necessarily have to put the years, but you certainly can if it's required on a template, or if you want to put the years in which you are you became a member for these societies. Just make sure you're honest with it. So if your membership has lapsed or you haven't renewed it, make sure you're not having that listed on your CV as a current thing that you're a membership of. Okay. So I think now we will leave the rest of the time. Well, thank you again for joining us today as we talked about kind of clinical and research-oriented CVs. And I believe now we can use the rest of the time for any questions folks might have.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Bergman and Dr. Mikopoulos. As Dr. Bergman said, we're now going to begin answering any questions from the audience. As a reminder, you can type in any questions through the chat box on your attendee control panel. So I guess we'll just wait a minute to see if anyone has any questions. All right, we got one question. How long do you leave unfunded grant proposals on your CV?
So, so pending is really for grant proposals that you have submitted but do not know if they have gotten a score or whether they've been funded. If they're in pending and you hear back from the funding agency that they will not get funded, then you take it out of that pending section.
Thank you, Dr. Mikopoulos. We have another question. How do you discern which trainings to list in advanced trainings?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's kind of dependent. So for me, I really wanted to highlight, because my background is PTSD, that yes, I was trained to do prolonged exposure in my lab, but then I went to a training with Dr. Foa to highlight that, highlighting the fact that I did the cognitive processing training through the VA. I'm currently in a DBT workshop and seminar. And so for me, it was really thinking about what are some of the specific clinical skills I might want a future employer to see. And then also highlighting, I did the CAMS training, which is for a suicide risk prevention and intervention. So just kind of highlighting, like, if it's my specialty, so PTSD, or if I'm really extending my skills to other things that might really kind of stick out, that's where I kind of went for that. Because I'm applying for jobs back in the VA, I also wanted to highlight during my internship year, I did the telemental health training. There is like a system-wide initiative to get more providers, not just psychologists, but to have some of their caseload via telehealth. So I at least wanted to show that I had done kind of the standard training for that. And I gotten like the quote unquote certification that I had passed that, of kind of how to do the bare bones of how you set that up. So you can think about during your graduate school career, if there's specific training opportunities, whether they're something part of your lab or you've sought outside of your lab time or you've done it at a conference, that again, either highlight your current expertise or really think this is really important for someone to know that I've done this.
Thank you, Dr. Bergman. We have a few more questions. They're a little long, so I'm actually going to send them in the chat box as well, so you can read them as I read them out loud. Do you separate research presentations from more clinically focused presentations, such as panels and roundtables at conferences like ADAA? For instance, would you have subheadings for each?
At least for my CV, that's a great question. I just have under one section just peer-reviewed presentations that includes both any posters I presented and symposiums. I don't separate them out by posters, symposiums. I've never participated in a clinically focused presentation, but I would say unless you have a lot in each of those sections, then it might make sense to kind of split them up. But if not, I think it's okay to keep, if it's a conference presentation, then it doesn't matter if it's necessarily clinically oriented or research oriented. But if you're feeling like you have a lot of them and for you it'd be important to have that subheading, it's not a bad idea for organization's sake.
Thank you. We have another question. Do you have any suggestions for applicants who may be applying for postdoc positions in which they may have limited experience in or are very different from their internship experience?
Great question. So I would say that really when you're applying to postdoc, like yes, your CV is one thing, but you also have your cover letter. And I know there is another webinar on kind of developing a cover letter and personal statement. So I'd say that if you're finding that you either have limited experience or what you did might not translate potentially to a position you want to apply to, like certainly list out as much as you can on your CV, but then really use that cover letter and personal statement, I would think, to kind of highlight why you think that might then translate to maybe this new kind of position.
Thank you, Dr. Bergman. We have a couple more questions. Do you have any recommendations for listing manuscripts in prep and those under review as you start to transition out of a training role? For example, do you still list manuscripts in prep or is that seen as fluff?
I mean, I still list them separately. If there's enough there, I have my sections of the ones that are actually published, those in prep, and those under review. If I only have like one in prep and one under review, I might put those together. But I do have them separated out because I think it's important to see, like, even after being a trainee, it's important to highlight what I have published, but also what I'm currently working on. What I'm currently like in prep versus what I've submitted, even if I don't know like what their decision is, just to show someone my progression of my what I'm trying to get published.
Right. I think keeping those sections is really helpful. But one thing to note is that if a lot, like having too many things in those sections and not keeping it updated could, be questionable. But I think they're good to have because exactly they highlight what you're currently working on, because we all know it could take 2 years at least to get a paper published. And so that's really the only way to show that you've got those things going on.
Yeah, absolutely. The ones I currently have in prep are manuscripts I'm actually currently working on. If I've had a manuscript and they're under prep and I have not worked on it or it's just not going anywhere, I obviously talk with the co-authors, but we all just decide we'll either submit it to a conference, but then I just take it off. So I don't keep it there. So if it's something I am not currently working on, I will not include in prep. I don't want to put things that it's not being like completely accurate about what I'm currently working on.
Great. We have one more question. For a research CV, should I remove older research experience in a field not as relevant to my current interests, such as biology research experience from 10 years ago?
So that is a great question. I actually found myself deleting some of that stuff out of my CV in the last couple of years. So I think as you progress in your career, it's okay to, focus it more on what you've done more recently. And maybe get rid of some of the things you may have done as an undergraduate or even during high school. But as far as to having a strict 10-year cutoff, I don't particularly have such a chronological cutoff. It's more of as you accumulate more things, keeping those and maybe losing some of the older stuff.
All right, I think that was our last question. Thank you so much, Dr. Bergman and Dr. Mikopoulos. I do have a few announcements. Our next ADA Live webinar will be held on November 29th, an Introduction to Prolonged Exposure Therapy for PTSD by David Yusko. And if you are not an ADA member yet, we invite you to view the many membership benefits that ADA has to offer. We would also like to invite you to save the date for ADA's annual conference on March 28th to March 31st. On behalf of ADAA and our presenters, we thank you so much for joining us today, and please be sure to complete the webinar evaluation that will be sent to you along with the online recording of today's webinar. Thank you for joining us.